and welcome to my interview with Dr. Sarah Denny Lorio on embryo adoption and some things related to IVF, since that's how this came to be. Well, I'm going to introduce and invite Sarah on here in just a few minutes. But first, I just want to kind of explain how this idea came to life. Several weeks ago, I put a question in my stories because I just wanted to get a feel for what people thought about IVF, specifically Catholics. And I wanted all of it, no matter what it was, good or bad, agree, disagree, personal experiences. I just want to get a gauge of where everybody was. And I got a ton of responses, which was really helpful for me to understand where everybody is. One of the most commonly asked questions or comments that I received was about embryo adoption. And so that's not something I know a lot about. Clearly I wanted to understand and learn more. And I thought it was so interesting that I would say it was pretty much split down the middle. Half of the people that responded were confident that the church is against it. The other half were pretty confident that the church hasn't had doesn't have a stance on it definitively either way. So I am so fortunate, and here she is coming on. Really knows this issue well, so that's why I talked to her about coming on here and sharing her wisdom with all of us, because she speaks so eloquently, and she just has this tremendous love for women. And I wanted you to hear it from her. And here we go. Here she comes. I think, I don't know. Let me see. I accepted it. Just having some technical difficulties over here. I'm accepting it, but it doesn't want to come through. Jesus, help us. Okay. So let's see. Sorry, guys. I don't know what the issue is. I'm pressing accept, but it's not it's not allowing her in. So give us just a minute. We will figure this out. I think she's trying again. Yeah, y'all say some prayers, because there she is.
Hi!
Yay! Hi, Sarah.
Oh my gosh, I'm like pushing buttons, but I'm glad
This has never happened before. All kinds of things go wrong.
Yeah,
It's okay.
yeah.
Come, Holy Spirit. Well,
Seriously.
I'm so glad for my audience to meet you and get to hear you talk about things,
Thank you.
get a little insight into what I get to witness as your friend. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. Can you hear me?
Okay, good. Yes, okay. I can hear you.
Perfect.
Actually, I meant to plug in this little microphone, so let me do that really quick. Okay.
Yeah, please.
Sarah, so I know it's long, but I want to read every word of it, if that's okay with you.
You would like to? You are free.
Okay, I put this bio in the post, but for those of you who are new and don't know who Sarah is, I just want to read this to you. So Dr. Sarah Denny Lorio holds a PhD in bioethics from the Pontifical Athenaeum, how do I say it?
Athenaeum.
Regina Apostolorum in Rome, and an MA in theology. That's a master's, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning so many things already.
You're doing great.
From Notre Dame Seminary and Graduate School in New Orleans, Louisiana, an avid speaker, her doctoral research focused on the differing philosophies that affect the practice of women's health in the United States of America, and argued for a third way of sex education that teaches young people fertility awareness-based methods, both as preventative medicine and as proximate vocation preparation. You'll fit right in with my audience. Throughout the last 12 years, Sarah has taught at both the university and high school levels, working as an ethics professor at Loyola University in New Orleans, teaching and coaching young women at Archbishop Chappelle High School and speaking and leading international trips for college students as a campus minister at LSU. She's trained in two different methods of fertility awareness, both Creighton and FEM. Her passion is to empower women through a deeper knowledge of the great gift and beauty of their bodies and sexuality. In her work, she consistently seeks to integrate the demands of medicine with the dignity of womanhood and highlights the essential role of human freedom in the education of young women. She is in the process of developing a high school curriculum focusing on these issues as well as creating similar resources for parents. And she currently lives in New Orleans, Louisiana, with her relatively new husband, Alex. So, Sarah, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, wait.
Thank you for having me. And
I
thank
think
you.
I messed things up with. Okay, say that again. I messed it up with my microphone. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. So, yeah, I'm just happy to be here. Thank you to your audience for having me. I'm glad that we can dive into this topic.
Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of give you the floor because I know we've talked about this a little bit. I don't even know where to start. So we're going to talk about embryo adoption. I just want you to kind of open up the topic with what you think is best.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best place to start is to explain. So I'm a bioethicist, which means my training and my job as an ethicist is to, in a sense, take a zoom out and look at the gift of science and the gift of medicine through the lens of and integrated with theology, philosophy, and also being aware of what's happening with the law. So my particular program focused on what's called a personalist bioethics. So the way I kind of describe that is if you imagine a triangle, at the top of the triangle would be this personalist ethics, but at the bottom, those two pieces, those 2 points, on one side would be biology, and on the other side would be philosophy. And I think that's important to start with because if we're really going to talk about a true ethics within medicine, we have to remember that it is only possible with a really robust, what I would call an anthropology of the human person. So a really robust philosophy of what does it mean to be human. And we need within this field, we need experts in biology. These are the physicians, the nurses, the PAs, everyone who's in some way, right, including fertility care practitioners, people that are trained in the biology is important. We also need those who are experts in philosophy. And the goal as a bioethicist is for me to take both of those fields in the ways that I've been trained to integrate those, always with the goal of respecting the dignity of the human person. Now, where this gets difficult is like with any other thing in our day-to-day lives, our emotions are involved because we're human beings, right? So it's not that those are unimportant. It's not that those don't have a place to play, but it's that we have to order our emotions, which is really part of our subjective experience. We have to order that and integrate that with the objective reality and objective truth. So that's the role of ethics, right? The church is not trying to say, oh, you're horrible if you even considered something that we said wasn't allowed. No, you're human, right? And the church is inviting her children to consider with her and to reflect, okay, what is it that I'm called to do in this particular moment? And we're talking about medical acts. We're talking about in a particular way when man intervenes in a sense upon man, right? So both parties, right, it's affecting their dignity and then that overflow of all the people that they're connected with and around. So my job as a bioethicist is never to tell someone you have to do this or you cannot do this, because in a sense, that's outside of my lane. As an ethicist, my job is to really educate and to inform people's consciences, right? And in a sense, to empower them so that they have the knowledge and the tools to then take what they know to be objectively true and to discern that and apply it to these like particular situations, which today we're talking about one, but that can be any number of situations, obviously. So in short, it would be like, my job is to say, okay, this is what the church's teachings are. Here's my opinion and recommendations I can make based on this data. At times, then here's some discussion within the church, especially an issue like this that isn't strictly prohibited, but there's a lot of concern surrounding it. And then really just like, I'm an advisor for you, giving you my input, but in a real way, it's very humbling. My work, so I also work currently as an ethicist with the National Catholic Bioethics Center. So please know at the end, I'll kind of highlight this again, but we offer free personal consultations to anyone, doctors, physicians, lay people who have a need for an ethical consult. And that can range from, this issue of frozen embryos than to, what sort of forms of after we die, what's actually ethically illicit, right? So the church has said, okay, burial is preferred, but then also has made room for, okay, cremation is also an option, but then we wouldn't agree with these options where, we return to the earth and it's like super green, but with a loss for the appreciation of like the human person. So we're always trying to keep the body and the soul, right, integrated in our decision making. And so that's my job, is to really illuminate that. But what I was saying before was, it's humbling for me because there's a place in discernment with every person I talk to, that at a certain point I reach the end of what I can say and where I can go, and they have to go a step further, and that's their call with the Lord. And it's an interior place. I can't make a judgment on that interior space. I'm not a spiritual director. I'm not a priest, so it's nothing that I'm saying is a condemnation or a judgment in that sense, but it truly is an invitation to see objective truth and objective reality for what it is in relation to particular issues, and the one that we're going to go into today. So how I would kind of sum that up in terms of what is bioethics, our goal is always to put science and technology at the service of the human person. So remember that, right? Like that's the foundation that we're starting from.
Yeah, and I think that was really helpful. So thank you for explaining bioethics and your role, because I think that's really important. We don't hear that explained much. And I love what you were saying. Just want to highlight a couple of things that stood out to me. Is you're helping us not to make emotional decisions, because as we know, in any topic, like as whatever it is, we know it's best to not make a decision based on how we're feeling, but a decision based on facts. Or discernment is both prayer and gathering facts and information. And that's what you're trying to help us do here.
Exactly.
And also just, again, highlighting that none of us can make a decision for anyone. Ultimately, we're responsible for the decisions that we make. So understanding that, I think, is very important too. And you're just here as a helpful guide, a gift from the church, so to speak, to help us in that discernment process.
Absolutely. Exactly. And yeah, if you have never heard of bioethics, or you were like, what the heck, this is the story of my life, right? I feel like I have to like come up with an elevator pitch sometimes. And like literally sometimes I'm like, have you seen Jurassic Park? Most people have. I'm like, okay, this is why it's important, right? Just because we can do these things doesn't mean we should. But truly, I'm grateful for you just highlighting that, because it really is an honor and it's a privilege. And I really mean that, because I'm led into places where people are wrestling, and I want it to be known before I really start getting into the nitty gritty of this. I do not have it all together. I do not know everything, right? There will be places where I will say, I don't know, right? And maybe the church has spoken and I need to go find it, right? So this isn't me saying either that I know everything, nor is it me saying, I can't understand why you would ever question that, right? I want people to know that as a bioethicist, first of all, as a person, uniquely as me, and Mary, you would know this as my friend, but I'm not someone who's just satisfied with like the surface level answer. Like I want to go deeper than that. And so for me, I would be inauthentic if I said that I never wrestled. And I think that's important to say, because I might actually know, right, the answer to these questions, but it doesn't mean that I always find them easy to follow, or, that they're just like easily palatable for like every single person, right? They take time. And I think the most important thing to say is, I do think that these questions and answers can be come to by natural reason, right? That's what I meant by the importance of philosophy. But the gift we have, especially in the Catholic faith, and we're talking specifically about the church, but it's a Christian worldview, but specifically the Catholic Church, is that we have been given grace to go into these hard places. And like we always talk about, right? If there's suffering, it's always an invitation to intimacy. So do not be afraid to wrestle. I have wrestled with this actual like particular question that we're going into today for, I think, about 12 years since I first started hearing about it. And I've been on one side, and then I've been like going to the other, and then I'm like pulled back to this side, and you'll probably see where I was starting and where I've ended up. But I want people to hear that going in. That I do not think really this helpful.
That's really helpful.
It's not
to show your humanity.
Yeah, trust me. Yeah, totally human. And so, and especially on the issues, just for the women to know, especially the issues where it affects women and to our core, trust me, ask if you could talk to my husband. I mean, you would be amused to hear from him sort of my, like when I get super fired up about something. I mean, I am like, I simultaneously feel called to be like, come on, church, like, what the heck are you thinking?
I
You know,
love fired up Sarah, by the way.
she
Salty
just goes,
Sarah.
that's
Yeah,
me.
love it.
But it's a beautiful, my call, right, is to bring to the church woman's voice, but then also to turn around and to bring to woman the church's, like, her why. And I think that's our struggle, is usually we're never given, I shouldn't say never, we're not always given the opportunity to be told why, or people don't know why and they skirt around it. And so then we're just left feeling overwhelmed and uncertain about how to proceed. And the reality is, you deserve the teachings as they are, because you as a human person have the capacity to reason, to come to understand. And that's what I mean by forming your conscience, is to tell you what to do is to be disrespectful of your dignity and your unique capacity to choose. I can't do that. The Lord doesn't even do that. And so today is about us approaching this topic from that whole foundation that I just offered you, right? So we're in this together. And it's almost as if I'm bringing you with me to look at the issue from like various vantage points and angles. And if you start to feel emotional, that's okay. I'm not saying like stuff it down, but I'm saying try to hear me all the way through to the end so that you can walk away from this and hopefully you can take it to prayer to then really like sit with it. And it doesn't mean that today you're going to land on it and be like, I'm satisfied. But in the least, you'll be given seeds that can blossom for you to have more confidence that at least you're thinking about it and moving in the right direction for what you can know to be objectively true.
Beautifully stated. And real quick before you move on, I want to make it clear that whether or not you are personally wrestling with the decision of embryo adoption, whether to move forward with it or not, this applies to you. And I think that's going to become more clear as we get to the end of the interview. Please stick around because, again, whether or not you're in this situation of making a decision to move forward with it or not, this applies to all of us. This affects the church. This affects our community. This affects our marriages. This affects women. So please stick around because this is something that applies to all of us. Like she's saying, she's going to bring up multiple facets. And by the end of it, I think we're really going to be, our minds are going to be opened a little bit more in the way we look at this situation.
Yeah. And you know, Mary, right, this is recorded.
Yes.
So you'll have it to chew back on. So I would just suggest, just listen. Like if you were like me, like I have to take notes, so I'm at that right now. I will share with you resources at the end, and then you'll be able to kind of follow this as you need. But I would say to really get started and to highlight your point you just made, the reason why this is so relevant and needs to be spoken about is for more than just the question of embryo adoption. It's literally at the heart of the IVF industry. And the best way for me to illustrate that would be to say that at this point, the numbers, which for the record are hard to keep track of because as of 2017, the CDC stopped tracking within artificial reproductive technologies and IVF. They used to be very specific and, okay, these are the ones that we have, you know, transferred. These are the ones that we have fertilized. These are the ones that we have now frozen and will transfer later. They're not really doing it as specific anymore. So the data is hard to get. Whereas in other countries, we have better data. So we'll use that to sort of make a better statistics. But at this point, we're all pretty confident that we have at least over 1 million frozen embryos. So it's not that, oh, it's just irrelevant. It's that they are there. And again, I might give you more to chew on and to think about, but I want you to at least know that that is the reality. And for me personally, the first time this ever even entered my mind was actually in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. I'm from New Orleans, live in New Orleans. And I remember, and I was 16 at the time, I remember seeing a news report a few months following the hurricane where a local hospital had accidentally and unknowingly switched the storage tanks or containers of couples' frozen embryos and then implanted them into the wrong couples. So there was a huge lawsuit. And, you know, I was 16. I did not know I was going to be a bioethicist, but I remember thinking, that's not good. You know, like being really convicted about the fact that that's extremely serious. And wow, I don't know if we should be in a position that we can just switch up people's kids, you know, in such sort of an intimate way. It's wild, but it's a reality, right? So when I'm talking about frozen embryos, I want you to know that from an ethics perspective, when we're having conversations with people, let's just say I would call it more largely, it's a question of embryo disposition. We call it disposition because we're talking about the whole like reality of what do we do with these children. And that's the other thing I think is really important to talk about is that, you know, the status in a sense of a frozen embryo is that these children are in a sort of stasis. They're frozen in liquid nitrogen. They are living, biologically they're alive, but the stasis is that they're moving at such a slow rate that they're essentially frozen, right? But it's so easy for us to say frozen embryos, and I can't tell you how many people mistakenly, like very much as an accident, and it's not a big deal. Like we all do it. They'll say, oh, frozen eggs, but frozen eggs and frozen embryos are very different things. Frozen eggs, right? Freezing the gametes. It's just a gamete. It doesn't have a soul. It's like a part of our body. Something we produce has been frozen. Okay, there's issues with that, but that is not at all the same thing as a frozen embryo, which is a human person, right?
Because the egg has not yet been combined with the sperm. That's the difference.
Right. It's
not a human person.
It's not its own organism,
yeah.
right? It's like, it's the cell, but it's not, boom, organism, human, and we are growing to life and alive. So I think that's important to talk about, but the essential thing is it's very difficult, especially because we have a lot of consults from parents who have embryos who are frozen, and they're like, what the heck do I do? Maybe they realize, you know, okay, at some point they didn't even realize, maybe they were never told IVF was wrong, which is also possible, right? And then they realize it was wrong, and then they're in this conversion and they're realizing, oh my gosh, I need to be aware of this. And so we have to walk with them in a conversation. So if you have a particular situation, this is why I would encourage you to reach out to the personal consultations department at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. You can just Google that, it's free. And you can be walked through with what your options are. Because again, it's a timing and it's a patient discernment, right? So, but the number one thing we say to start the conversation is, it's almost like you have to, like if I were talking in person, of course, this would be easier over email. I'm not going to say it like this, but you know, these are your children. So as much as you can refer to them as your children, it's going to help you to understand, oh, these are my children I'm talking about. So for some parents, it's like, just as much as you have these 2 girls in college, baby, and you're bragging about them, I'm like, those children, so too these other children, like they're the same, they're your children, you know, and you're trying to, in a sense, do right by them because you are their parents,
it's
right?
Really humanizing embryos, because
yes,
I think even unintentionally in our brains, we separate them, like they're different, like they're somehow less important, like they're still they're going to be human, but they're not the same as someone who's born. But right. We need to like humanize them, and that I think alone changes how the conversation affects people.
Exactly. Yeah, it absolutely does. So that is like our starting point. Now, in terms of what the church specifically has said, there are 2 documents that I recommend. You know, you may not want to go down the rabbit hole if this is not the issue you feel called to. Totally respect that. Not a big deal. However, if you would like to go deeper, and I do encourage people, you're smart enough. Like the church is writing these things for your formation and your education. So if you are at all interested, I would go read it. The first one is called Donum Vitae. So that is the CDF Instruction on Respect for Human Life in its Origin and on the Dignity of Procreation. But in a real sense, it's replies to certain questions of the day. Now that document is from 1987. So it's relevant, right? It's in vitro fertilization had already begun, right? Abortion was already legalized in America. Like we know all of that. But again, we could see and imagine how from 1987 onward, technology is also advanced. And so then the CDF came out with same name of a document, but it's it doesn't erase Donum Vitae, it builds on it, right? To respond to then what are the pressing questions of today that we now need to address because we need to make it more clear based on the reality of what we're facing, right? And that document, the second one, is called Dignitas Personae, and that's from 2008. So both of these together are a really great place to start if you would like to go a little bit deeper into the in vitro fertilization, artificial reproductive technology question at large. It goes into all these different facets of that. Now, as some of you who might have been familiar with, I know with the questions you got, Mary, people refer to paragraph 19 from Dignitas Personae, And that is exactly the paragraph that I want to focus on today. So I could just tell you what it says, but in reality, it's not that long. And I think it's actually most valuable for you if I go through it with you.
Please.
So I'm going to read it to you.
Yeah.
It's short, but I'm going to go through, it's like 5 little parts, and I'm going to explain what they're relevant to. So keeping in mind that the goal of this, right, is that they want to, like, this is a quote from earlier in the document. It says, careful reflection on this teaching of the magisterium and on the evidence of reason, as mentioned above, enables us to respond to the numerous moral problems posed by technical interventions upon the human being in the first phases of his life and upon the processes of his conception. So what we're trying to do is use the wisdom of the church that is, thousands of years old, using reason, using revealed revelation, right? Using all of this as tools in our toolbox to then respond to these very important essential questions. So number 19 is going to directly address what to do about the frozen embryos. So this is the first part. It says, with regard to the large number of frozen embryos already in existence, the question becomes what to do with them. Some of those who pose this question do not grasp its ethical nature, motivated as they are by laws in some countries that require cryopreservation centers to empty their storage tanks periodically. In other words, that sentence, what they're saying is some people are not asking what to do with them because of an ethical quandary. They're not even aware of it being an issue. They literally, right, are responding to laws. Different countries have laws that after a certain amount of time, boom, right, you dump the embryos
They
out.
probably need
okay,
space,
and they're going to die,
or like some other, whatever it is.
It could be, yeah, any number of reasons, but yeah. But then it goes on. It says, others, however, are aware that a grave injustice has been perpetrated and wonder how best to respond to the duty of resolving it. So, regardless of where you stand or how you feel about my presentation of this, right, or what the church is saying, I want you to hear what the church is acknowledging, and we can all agree on this point. A grave injustice has been perpetrated, right? We have these over 1 million children who are older than us, but have not yet been given the opportunity to live, right? And there's a lot that comes with that. There's a lot of unknowns. Just remember that too. With embryo transfer, how long are the embryos really viable? How healthy is it for the mom if right, she were to in some way discern even adoption, right? It's loaded. There's nothing I can tell you today that's like, and here I dressed it up in a pretty bow and I'm giving it to you now. It's easy, right? So I want us to start from this place of we can all agree that this is problematic and this is a really big deal and there's an injustice. So what the next part does is it specifically states what cannot be done with frozen embryos. And this quote, proposals to use these embryos for research for the treatment of disease are obviously unacceptable because they treat the embryos as mere biological material and result in their destruction. So sometimes couples are approached after a certain period of time. Couples do have to keep in mind they have to pay, right, monthly, yearly, it depends on the facility, to keep their children alive, right? I put that in quotes. They are alive, but I mean like in liquid nitrogen in this bizarre state. So sometimes what's happening is they're being asked and they're being presented with the option, like, would you like to donate your children for research? Now, zoom out for a second with me. It's harder for probably a lot of your listeners to really think, wait, that would be, a generous thing. But for someone who's not formed in this, they might be like, oh, I heard this thing about embryonic stem cells, which there have been no successful proof of use of those, but they might think, okay, well, then I should do that. So it's making very clear the embryos are human persons. They are not mere biological material, right? The frozen eggs, that is biological material, right? The frozen embryos are human beings. Vast difference. And what happens is after a certain point with the research, they destroy the embryo. So if you give your children to research and your children are frozen embryos, then they will be destroyed in the end.
They
so
become
it's making
object of use, and they're
exactly.
That's another way of dehumanizing.
Exactly. And everything the church is saying no to is always going to be because it is dehumanizing, right? Because it is objectifying, and it's no longer this person who is a subject, right? Who is respected in and of themselves. So it goes on to say, the proposal to thaw such embryos without reactivating them and use them for research as if they were normal cadavers is also unacceptable. So to sum that up, you cannot use embryos for research, and you cannot use embryos in that same vein for the treatment of any disease.
Right, because don't adults can't they, you can donate your body to science after you die,
Mm-hmm.
right? But they need your consent.
Right. Yes. Which in the history of medicine, which just like every other thing that's human, that wasn't always there. That was problematic. That was sketchy.
Gotcha.
I mean, that's been a long time. But
Okay.
yes, you can consent freely to give your body to science. And there is a nobility to that because, you know, all the medical students that I speak to, you can't really get your way around the cadaver lab, right? Now, I will tell the audience just to know, because I just had this conversation 2 days ago with medical students. I spoke to the pro-life club at LSU's medical school here in New Orleans, and they were sharing about how truly unanimous, like despite sort of belief system, at least from what they can tell, everyone is going in really respectful. Like it's a very humbling experience to be a medical student, to dissecting a person, and they really do their best to humanize the person. Really, so I just want people to know, like, that's a really beautiful thing. Now, I can't say that happens everywhere. I'm sure it doesn't, but I was very pleased to hear that it happened here.
That
and
is something
to hear
they're even thinking about.
Yes, they were they were more concerned with, like, I know this is okay, but this is wild, because they were so respectful of the person, you know? And so I was walking them through the gift of, this is only possible because this person has consented and desired that even after death, their body would be a gift, right? And that's the beauty of our faith, right? Is that no matter how the dissections go, like, we believe in the resurrection of the body. And I'm like, man, I can't wait for that when that happens, you know? But in the meantime, that was a gift that they were offering. So the next part within Dignitas Personae, paragraph 19, is the part that makes clear, and this is something that I think is essential, because I think a lot of people ask the question from this vantage point, but there's one part where it is very clear. And it is that embryos, these frozen embryos, cannot be used as treatment for infertility. So let me read the quote. The proposal that these embryos could be put at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility is not ethically acceptable for the same reasons which make artificial heterologous procreation illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. Now, I'm just going to define some terms for a second, because I think that's helpful. Okay.
Let's take a breath. I just want to, as likely please. A large audience, part of the audience has infertility or struggles with it. This can, like, be hard to swallow and read. Just me hearing it, like, I fully support and understand the church's teaching, but the words themselves, they can hit kind of hard. And so this is something that we can do a better job recognizing as the church, even though this is true and it is good and it is beautiful. Let's take a breath as we, like, just to lean in and get curious and recognize how it makes us feel in our bodies, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And just keep going.
No, I'm really glad you said that, because, you know, I think it's very difficult in a sense to feel singled out by a document for something that is not under your control. Right?
Something that already hurts so badly, so deeply.
It is a deep cross, a deeply piercing cross. Exactly. Yeah. And I think for many people, I mean, for me, even reading it, you know, like 10 years ago, I'm like, man, that makes me angry. And it really did. It did. Now, I had to do my own searching, and I still am, right, to go deeper into why. And the why makes it a bit more palatable. Like, it gives me a space to hold it. But it can be both.
Yes.
That I can hold it and understand that it's true. And I'm also like, dang it, that's hard.
Yes.
You know? So I want to define some terms and then explain something for a second about this part. So artificial heterologous procreation, for those who don't know. So artificial reproductive technologies, right? That's where the artificial comes from. It'll distinguish, we usually distinguish within IVF between homozygous and heterologous. And it's just meaning homo, same, so that's the child is conceived with the gametes, the sperm and the egg, from its parents, right? So heterologous is anything that would include the donor egg or donor sperm is not the biological parent of the child being conceived and then caring for that child. So basically everything in frozen embryo, except for a subset that we'll talk about, which is those who might decide, like, let's say a decade later, to go back for the rest of their children, which could be someone listening, right? That's a different subset. Please remember to get to that at the end. But that could potentially still be homozygous, but everything else, it's heterologous. Okay. And it's saying that is illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. So I'm going to read it one more time to kind of put it together. The proposal that these embryos could be put at the disposal of infertile couples as a treatment for infertility is not ethically acceptable for the same reasons which make artificial heterologous procreation illicit, as well as any form of surrogate motherhood. So when it's talking about surrogate motherhood, earlier on in the document, it made a point about surrogate motherhood and the issues with it. And I'm going to read to you what it said. It said, for the same reasons that we reject heterologous artificial fertilization, right? So donor sperm, donor egg is coming in, and it's not connected to who would then be the parent of the child, right? And this is all connected with frozen embryo adoption. It's contrary to the unity of marriage and to the dignity of the procreation of the human person. Surrogate motherhood represents an objective failure to meet the obligations of maternal love, of conjugal fidelity, and of responsible motherhood. So I want to say something. Some people like to separate this part of the conversation. I think it's hard to do, but I see why they're doing it, to the conception of the child by a third party, which would apply to the things I just read. And they want to separate that from embryo transfer. So the process of taking the frozen embryo, transferring it, and then placing it into the woman's womb. But I think however you do it, whether it's combined or separate, the next line I'm about to read still applies, which is this. It says, it offends the dignity and the right of the child to be conceived, carried in the womb, brought into the world, and brought up by his own parents. It sets up, to the detriment of families, a division between the physical, psychological, and moral elements which constitute those families. So it's not saying that it is a one-to-one comparison and that, this is the exact same thing as surrogacy, but it's saying there are so many parallels, and so it is impossible for us to separate the question from the same reasoning that we have come to of why surrogacy is wrong. Does that make sense? That it's the rights within marriage. We're respecting the fidelity between husband and wife, right? And so much of that is the act of procreation, where in vitro fertilization, right, separates that unitive, the union, and the procreative, the procreation aspect of marital intimacy. But then I think it's also really essential that we don't forget it's talking about the right of the child to be conceived, gestated, supported, right, carried within the womb of its mother. And in a certain way, we're talking about frozen embryo adoption, we are clearly trying to recognize the rights of a child, but the rights are so multifaceted. And all I'm trying to say is that the church's wisdom is that there are multiple rights at stake. And I mean, this is me kind of giving the answer out before the end, but basically there is no solution that is just, oh, that's perfect. That's easy. And I have no moral quandaries with that. That doesn't exist. That's why they're trying to go through this. So, like line by line, what it means. So for those of you who struggle with infertility, I want you to hear me when I say that the cross and that burden is so real. This is not a condemnation of the desire to have a child. It's not a condemnation of the discernment to adopt a child. It's not a condemnation of you if you are the ones who actually have already gone through with this, right? But what I'm saying is that the church is trying to help us to see that a child is not a commodity. So, and this doesn't mean that everyone is feeling this way, but when you're struggling to conceive, even if you're not struggling to conceive, I mean, just the way that our culture is built, right? It's sort of like this other thing we're just supposed to have in our timeline of life, right? And we can be in a place where we unknowingly, unintentionally, just sort of like subconsciously commodify children, where they become the means to the end of my becoming a parent, right?
Yes.
Like that then the child solves the problem for me, instead of for the child's own sake, right? I want to offer this. And again, there's a part where my guidance is going to stop because you enter an interior space with the Lord. I can't go there. So I'm not judging or condemning, but I'm saying the reason why the church makes a very clear line here for couples struggling with infertility is because they are trying to say, hey, infertility is such a huge struggle, but the solution cannot be that then, oh, this child already exists, that's going to solve my problem, and so then I can just adopt these frozen embryos. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So hold it with all of the feelings and the pieces and the reality, because it is very real, and the church is just trying to protect the children from them being commodified in a different way, because they already also have been, right? But if you wanted to add something, Mary.
Well, this confused me reading it. I think you probably answered my
No,
question a
please.
little bit, but I was just confused as to why it was singling out infertility, because this would apply to any couple, whether or not they were struggling, right? Like, because, but is it singling out infertility specifically because this group of people in particular are looking, maybe more looking to grow their families? That it's simple as that.
I think it is that, let me put it this way. And again, I mean, I'm with you, and we're all sort of learning this together.
Okay.
That, sorry, I'm also trying to like move the Instagram
I
so
know.
I can still see your face. I don't know
I
why.
can't get it moved either.
It's fine. Well, I can see you. When you're struggling with infertility, you, in your heart of hearts, like the desire for a child is a beautiful, good thing.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, we are created, like you and I talked about, we're created to be fruitful, and this is a part of the gift that God has entrusted to us as human beings, that we can participate in this intimacy and then be able to, oh my gosh, bring new life into the world, right? When we are unable to conceive, we are looking at multiple options, right, of how to solve the problem. And some of those, like we've talked about, restorative reproductive medicine, which I am a big fan of, right? Those are ethically illicit because they go to the root cause of the issue, and they seek, right, to basically restore reproductive integrity.
Right.
But that's different than, okay, I'm going to go over here and this child already exists, because what's happening is it's sort of hard to get around, in a sense, like I'm paying someone to then implant this child into my womb. I really want to become a parent. Once I have that child, I am a parent. Like, does that make sense? It's again, it's not a disrespectful thing, but I think it's because I have wrestled with, like, why do you single them out so much? But I think it is because it's so quickly seen as, oh, well, and that's the solution I can do. And then the child becomes the solution instead of the object of my love. Does that make sense? Like, I don't even know the child yet, but it's like, oh, one of those will work because it fixes my problem. Not that I don't say people mean it that flippantly, but it's like in the process of thinking and discerning.
I wonder if, like, in its prudence, it's like, well, people might think, but if I'm infertile, then that is a good enough reason. And I wonder if they're just like, well, actually, like, no, this does not make it okay.
Yes.
Or I don't even want to say that because it's an individual discernment, right? But that's probably why they're specifically using those couples.
They're trying to make lines where they can make lines in a space where the church is not. Does that make sense? Where it's not yet strictly prohibited yet, which I'll get to in a second. But I do want to say the church is such a supporter of adoption, right? Like adoption at large, as Mary can speak to with an adopted daughter. This is not easy for me to say. This is a part I've been wrestling with. So this is not the church speaking. This is Dr. Sarah Denny Lorio, just me sifting through the data on my own and really discerning it, right? In this place where we are trying to figure out, okay, but if adoption's okay, well, then why isn't this okay? But I hate to say it this way, but there are so many children who are alive. This isn't that they have greater dignity than the ones who were frozen, but it is that there's a space and a time. And, like, let's say from the abortion perspective, if this mother does not choose adoption, this child has no other option in this moment. It's right in front of me and it's pressing. If this child who is in the foster system, right, is not given an option, this is pressing, and there is, like, time is passing. It doesn't make it better, but because they are frozen in liquid nitrogen in that space of stasis, it's almost like the church is trying to figure out, okay, is there any other option we can come up with that would be morally illicit? Since, in a sense, it's not that we have all the time in the world, but we have the time to figure it out in a different way. Does that make sense? And remember, the church is 2,000 years old. Frozen embryos, the reality of that is not 2,000 years old. So it's easy to be like, oh my gosh, the church is so slow. But trust me, I've said before. But in reality, the church is prudent and she's wise, and she can't give us something she's not yet ready to give us. And we don't actually want that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
So I want you to hear like the beauty and the glory and the goodness of adoption from that perspective of the child, right? And then for me, the other piece, because we're talking about procreation and unitive, right? It is really different. Now, I'm not saying to hyper spiritualize it, but there's a vast difference between, and it is a spiritual reality, between I'm adopting a child that I'm being given from this adoptive mother as a baby or older, right? And then within my womb, I am going to have implanted, right, an embryo that is not from my marriage.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
And so the church is trying to protect the child while she's trying to protect, and I'm thinking, I feel like one of the people actually in your comments, that was perfect. Yeah. While she's trying to protect, that's exactly what we're talking about. The integrity of the marital act, right? It's always, we don't want to separate them from each other, even in our conversation about this. But that's what it meant earlier when I was talking about heterologous artificial fertilization and surrogacy. I'm going to read that part again. It says, it's an objective failure to meet the obligations of maternal love, of conjugal fidelity, and of responsible motherhood. And then it says, it offends the dignity and the right of the child to be conceived, carried in the womb, brought into the world, and brought up by his own parents. So another part higher up than that also might be helpful to hear, that's part of that same description, why heterologous artificial fertilization is wrong, why it violates the rights of the child, and also, right, the rights within marriage that we have, that which, like, the two become one, right? It says it deprives him of his filial relationship with his parental origins and can hinder the maturing of his personal identity. Furthermore, it offends the common vocation of the spouses. I love this line. The common vocation of the spouses who are called to fatherhood and motherhood. It objectively deprives conjugal fruitfulness of its unity and integrity. It brings about and manifests a rupture between genetic parenthood, gestational parenthood, and responsibility for upbringing. Such damage to the personal relationships within the family has repercussions on civil society. What threatens the unity and stability of the family is a source of dissension, disorder, and injustice in the whole of social life. But I think it's important to hear that part where it says it brings about and manifests a rupture between genetic parenthood, gestational parenthood, and responsibility for upbringing. So, when I'm talking with my husband about it, he's actually a well-trained philosopher, but if I'm trying to, figure out how to explain this, not in this, maybe this is a longer setting, but if I only have a nutshell, he's able to say, from his perspective, he's like, okay, but you being pregnant with someone else's child and us adopting that is very different.
Yeah.
Right. Than us adopting a child. And I think that's fair to say, again, not as a condemnation, but as an invitation. And so again, if you're struggling with the part that they are singling out couples who are infertile, I want you to wrestle with that. But I want you to hear that what the church is trying to do is, if you are infertile and you are trying to use it as a solution to your infertility, I don't know how on an internal level you can separate that the child becomes your solution in some way, right? Do I think? Yes. I would 100% believe that every couple who's considering it, there's a sacrificial, heroic aspect to the discernment, right? I'm not saying that's not there, but I'm saying it would take a very serious discernment, and again, between you and the Lord, spiritual director, to really kind of pull through the weeds of that. But I don't know how you can separate in the heart of the human person where all of my other options I've run out, and then, okay, but this could be the thing that fixes it, right? And again, not in a condemnation, but I'm saying that that's the reality. The church is trying to prevent the child from becoming the commodity and the solution to the infertility problem, right? Especially when there's other ways the church has so supported how we can deal with, right? So yeah. Now let's keep going,
And
because I don't want people to miss this last part too. Which is,
I know.
No, keep. What's
Really
your question?
quickly, it's okay too. I think a lot of women in this situation do truly desire life for those babies. Like that is also a big
Absolutely.
motivation.
Yes.
And so
100%
just want to to say that
And
out
I've
loud, like that.
met couples who have
Yeah.
have gone down this path.
Yeah.
And I
Yes.
mean, I've been brought to tears. There's a beauty, there's a beauty. Like we have to reverence the beauty in the fact that this is such a difficult topic because it's
Yeah.
so enmeshed in so many facets, right? So
And
again,
specifically to the heart of
yeah.
woman who is created to be a mother, and we
Yes.
see these a million frozen embryos. Like, that's why this is so
Mm-hmm.
difficult. And
Yes.
I'll just another little disclaimer. Like, probably not going to leave this interview feeling great. Like Sarah said, like I feel one way or the other. Like, but I want to focus on why we're in having this conversation in the first place is because of what happened before that embryo was frozen in the first place. That's the only reason we're even having this conversation. The focus has to be back on IVF. That's what that industry is, what has caused this problem, and this just is uncomfortable. Just
Yeah.
if that's where you are, that's okay.
Yeah.
Like that is
Yeah.
this is just
100%.
uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. So some people, and again, I want them to hear this too, is it's so easy to then jump to, which people make this jump, but just a few more minutes, I'm going to explain there's nuances that I have to make because that's my job as a bioethicist, right? The, the reason why this question is still on the table is because the church said very clearly no to this subset of people. And my argument is going to be that though she didn't strictly prohibit it, right, it seems very much as if she is suggesting this does not appear to be a solution, right? So, but I need you to just keep walking with me to kind of see how. But I really want to thank you, Mary, for saying that because I this is like, and for a long time, it was like my least favorite issue. And that's saying something to chalk on because I'm like, oh, so many feelings, you know. But again, I'm offering this to you for you to consider and for you to hear it from someone who's trained in the mind of the church in this capacity so that you can really see it through to the end. So I'm going to keep going because I want to
Yes,
give you some of the
please
conversations that are
do.
happening in the church. So, okay, after it says that, the final part, remember I told you there's like 5 parts within Dignitas Personae. So I went through the first part, what you can't do. We went through the second part, which, you know, further that. Went through the third part, which, okay, so we can't use this as a treatment for infertility. Now the fourth part. So this is where they specifically reference prenatal adoption. It has also been proposed solely in order to allow human beings to be born who are otherwise condemned to destruction, that there could be a form of prenatal adoption. This proposal, praiseworthy with regard to the intention of respecting and defending human life, presents, however, various problems not dissimilar to those mentioned above. And when it says above, it means when we talk about surrogacy and also the medical, psychological, and legal ramifications of the IVF industry and for a woman who's within that space. It goes on the next paragraph in the last paragraph of this section to say, all things considered, it needs to be recognized that the thousands, and now we know at this point over 1 million, of abandoned embryos represent a situation of injustice, which in fact cannot be resolved. Therefore, John Paul II made an appeal to the conscience of the world's scientific authorities, and in particular to doctors, that the production of human embryos be halted, taking into account that there seems to be no morally licit solution regarding the human destiny of the thousands and thousands of frozen embryos, which are and remain the subjects of essential rights and should therefore be protected by law as human persons. So, take a deep breath for a second. There was a lot that just said. I want to note the first point, that it acknowledges how praiseworthy it is that people have this desire with the intention of respecting and defending human life. But I can have that praiseworthy desire, and I have to hold that intention with the reality where the church makes very, very clear that it always spoke to the infertile couple very specifically. The fertile couple, there remain various serious problems, which are illustrated by what I explained earlier about surrogacy and heterologous artificial fertilization. And so my sort of way of talking to people about this, you know, I've met people who get really upset for good reason, and they want me to tell them what to do. And they want the church to say, tell us what to do. Like, here's the problem, fix it. I think we all have to come to terms with the fact that we have brought ourselves here as human beings. God said, this is the fruit, do not eat it at this time. And we said, oh, it looks great, we're going to do it anyway. He's very clear, right, of what not to do. And it was very clear, do not make human beings outside of the intimacy, right, the unity, the procreative, the integrity of the marriage, right, where this is the most safe, healthy, human way to bring a child within the world, like into the world, right? It's to co-create with God in that way, not a third-party technician, right? Not paying for it to take place in the sense that you're like, okay, I'm almost buying this child, you know? And so I think that is extremely relevant because it's just so hard when you come up against it and we want an answer. And the way that I found peace, to be totally honest, is and I don't mean this to be disrespectful, it feels kind of blunt, but I feel like it's the sense of like, we've made our bed, we have to lie in it. Like, we need to sit with the fact that this is really difficult. And this is really difficult because we went very clearly against a very clear teaching, right? And now we're looking at the church. And I think it's interesting because I feel people, sometimes you get so angry at the church and you're blaming her, but you're asking her to, in a sense, we tied a bunch of knots, morally speaking, and for her to untie those knots, she would have to jump through the hoops of things she already said we cannot do, including, right, something that's akin to surrogacy, and surrogacy is clearly off the table. And so it's not that easy. Now, I do think it's important at this point, before I land the plane, I want to say something, and this is important. The church has spoken very clearly to the infertile couple. I would argue that I think the church, though she has not strictly prohibited it to, we would say then what's left will be the fertile couple, that she has brought up the question enough to say, okay, though she doesn't say clearly no, she really doesn't say it's okay, right? She's not saying, well, this is a great idea, this is the solution. In fact, she's literally saying in this last part, what she's saying is that it is a situation of injustice which in fact cannot be resolved. She's making that is a statement. That is a very clear statement. But the way the church works is that because she didn't come out and say it as clearly as she could, which is leaving room for the discussion amongst theologians and people like us, right? You are allowed to wrestle. I mean, you're allowed to wrestle with any of the church's teachings, right? But this is one where there are many theologians in this country who are on either side of the debate. One of them, who I really respect, Janet Smith, I would say she's one of my heroes. Janet Smith argues for frozen embryo adoption. She sees it as akin to wet nursing, and she thinks it would be a completely generous use of, in a sense, a donation of our own bodies for the sake of these children. She also kind of widens that a bit to embryo adoption could be if the technology could come to that point that, you know, if a woman, her words, not mine, but if a woman were, let's say, diagnosed with cancer and then she had to take chemo treatment, well, then maybe her sister could somehow then gestate her embryo for her so that she could start chemo, right? So that's Janet Smith's line of thinking, at least the last time I saw what she published. Janet Smith is allowed to say that, right? If the church were to come out tomorrow and say definitively, absolutely not. Like, and the church, by the way, as we all know, is very capable of doing that. And if she must, she will. Then Janet Smith, I know because she's faithful to the magisterium, is going to say, okay, the answer is no. Now, there's another woman I know of, Elizabeth Rex, I think is her name. And I've only recently come to be aware of her writings, but she is one that will separate the IVF portion of the procedure, so the actual conception of the child in the lab, from the embryo transfer portion of the procedure. I will say that my review, and she's allowed to disagree with me, like I said, for the same reasons as Janet Smith, I think she assumes and reads into documents things that are not there. I think it's a bit of a stretch. I think the semantics is what she ends up arguing over, and I think she reads into the document things that it's not saying. Oh. Now, I will tell you that what I hear her doing is an emotional cry on behalf of these children, which is beautiful and good, and I completely agree with her on that, right? So she and I agree on, gosh, this is not right for these children. But where we diverge is, she believes that this is the solution. Now, she's not saying it's perfect, but she's saying it's the best we've got. We should do it.
Yeah.
And someone is allowed to think that, right? But there are other theologians that are on the other side of it that say, let's look at the document. At least at this point, there's nothing that tells us it's a good idea. So though it may not be strictly prohibiting it for all people, it's very clear that the church is like, hey, I don't know if that's a good idea. Now, with that, I will say that currently, that is where I fall. 12 years ago, I had to write this paper, and I was like, diehard no to embryo adoption, because I felt in a particular way, I felt like it was such an abrupt reality of implanting a child within the womb of its mother that to me felt too akin to the surrogacy I had learned about. And I was like, and then where do you draw your lines for that? How do you make that standard?
Yeah.
Like, what kind of woman's allowed to implant it? Like, can she be single? Does she have to be married? Right? Does, like, all of the questions that you can assume can be wrapped up in there are part of that. And I just felt like, while we want to think it takes care of the problem, I see it creating many more problems, right? Just many more problems. And so I think because of the integrity of the marital act, as well as the rights of the child, while this is a very difficult topic for me, and very emotionally charged, and I want emotionally to be able to say, actually, yeah, I think it's okay. When I take all of it, like I told you in the beginning, my job is to take our emotions and we integrate them with our reason and how we've been formed, how my conscience has been formed, how I've been formed in the tradition of the church. I believe that that is not advisable, and that is not what the church is saying. I can tell you that we're allowed to debate. I can tell you that we're allowed to disagree, because we are, right? If the church comes out tomorrow and says no, then I'm like, okay, no. I do not foresee, now look, I can be proven wrong, and I'm totally fine with that. I don't foresee the church coming out and saying yes, because I think it's fraught with way too many dangers and problems, right? I don't know if she's ever going to move out of this position. But so then this position does mean that someone, in a sense, right, it would seem to say not infertile couples, but couples who are fertile could then adopt these children. But I want to make something very clear. I don't think that we get on our soapbox and we say, hey, everyone should do it, because this is like such a great solution. I think we do need to talk about, I think sometimes people might overdo this concept, but it's relevant. And in this case, I think it is relevant and necessary, the concept of scandal, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to stand up and say that, oh, this is okay, and the church said so, everyone should do it. I'm like, no, the church didn't say that. And I do not think that this solution is one that is pretty or neat or clean. And I know that life is messy, but yet this is not the way. I do not see this as a way that is really what we want. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's so fraught with difficulty. So if this is what somebody feels called to do, just remember, you could be misinterpreting it. But again, I'm not condemning you as a person. Like, I'm not going into that internal space of discernment. That's not my job. But I'm saying, in particular, before you start telling the whole world we should do this,
Right.
I think we need to come to terms with the fact that this is a big deal, and this in and of itself, I want frozen embryo adoption to be a clean solution, but I do not see morally, ethically, philosophically how it can be.
It's just so not black and white, and so many people already misunderstand or don't understand the church's teachings on the human person, woman, IVF, to go out and say, like, to use an example on Facebook or something, like, we're going to go do embryo adoption. It's just like, what messages that could be sending to so many different people unintentionally. We just got to be careful. Am I correct in kind of explaining that way?
No, I think what you're saying is an understanding of scandal, where we have a responsibility to do our due diligence, right? And finding out, what does the church teach, and then discerning from there. We also have a responsibility to those who may not be in a position to do that information searching,
Yeah.
If we just say, oh, this is fine, this is great, this is like the quick fix, without having the evidence, because that is not the evidence, right, in these documents,
right,
then it can really confuse people even more. And that affects not just this question, but their relationship with the Lord, essentially, right? And their understanding of what the church desires for them, which is their good. And so there's a few things I want to say. If you can hold on to me for like 5 more minutes, I want to land this plane with succinct points. Because I just blew up the bomb, and now I'm like, wait, don't stop listening yet. Okay. Number one, I think I should review what you cannot do with frozen embryos. So you can't give them to science for experimentation because that involves their destruction. You cannot discard them as medical waste because obviously that involves their destruction. There is no form of surrogate motherhood, especially, you know, with understanding of contract arrangements where this would be appropriate. And the document also makes clear that you cannot give the embryos to infertile couples to use as treatment for infertility. Now, again, as we said before, some faithful Catholic thinkers think that Dignitas Personae does not categorically, as they would, that's like a philosophical way of saying, like categorically close the door to all types of prenatal adoption. So that's where the debate is there any form of prenatal adoption that would be okay? So some, right, are for it because they say, okay, we can consider it rescue adoption. There's strictly limited ways that maybe it could work. And others say it can never be legitimate. And I fall under that boat, because there's fundamental moral problems with the embryo transfer itself, right? Again, this is not the fault of the embryo, but it still just creates more problems within the people who, I believe everyone's trying to do the right thing, but it creates more problems. So in short, teaching of the church, respected theologians argue from both sides. So there's a lot to sift through. But I think if you're frustrated about this, I have some points for you that I think this is what you need to bring up in conversation. Number one, I do want to say that there's a lot of hope in the sense that when I first learned about this issue, I will tell you that I was so overwhelmed with the reality because I was like, does God want to come back? Like, is Jesus coming back now? Because now like, this is so crazy. Like, and I know this sounds crazy, but I came to the conclusion of if he hasn't come back yet, that means there's still more he has in his plan for humanity, and there's hope, and he wants to move, and he wants to move through us, right? Yeah. So we need to keep going deeper into this. But the biggest thing I can say is stop making embryos. Stop making embryos. Stop making embryos. Stop making embryos. John Paul II, and this is what the document references, he made an appeal to the conscience of the world's scientific authorities, and in particular to doctors, that the production of human embryos be halted. He takes into account that there seems to be no morally licit solution regarding their destiny. They have rights, they should be protected by the law, but he literally says we need to halt the production of these embryos. That is a very clear black and white thing that you can take from this document. And we have over 1 million because we have not heeded that advice. So some would argue, and this is just something to consider, that if we were to ever get behind this idea of embryo adoption, then we would in our own way sort of be supporting the IVF industry because it would create this sort of market. I will say that I have seen, I can't say every, but there are some aspects to, they'll call it sometimes snowflake babies or snowflake adoption. I have seen people market it in such a way that I have felt that, where it's like pushed, like, you should do this, like this is your moral duty. It is not. It does not say that. It does not say that anywhere in the document. And I think I just had a really good question, that there's many Catholic priests and doctors who misunderstand the church's teachings. I would say, one, study this, really like use this sort of as your evidence, and then use Instagram lives like this, right? Like share this with people if you think it's helpful for them to learn really what does the church teach step by step. Because if they want a 30-second soundbite, then they shouldn't be involved in the IVF industry, because these people know how to be patient, because everyone is trying for a good, but some people are manipulating that, and some people are desperate for it, and some people are just trying to do the right thing and they don't know how, right? But I think it's important that we educate ourselves. I will share that there's a doctor on Instagram that I personally love. Shout out to Dr. Naomi Whitaker, and Mary introduced me to her. But she said that, I asked her some questions about the IVF process because she did her rounds in an IVF clinic. And I was like, well, what kind of restrictions would you like to see? She said, any. She's like, any would be great. So I want people to be aware of the fact that, I'm like leaning in, I'm like, y'all, this is crazy, but it is. There is no organizing body that is technically over the IVF industry, monitoring it, saying there's a limit to the number of embryos. So while this clinic over here might limit it at 3, that clinic over there, not necessarily. And when I asked Dr. Whitaker directly, like, what's necessary, like, to limit it, she said the only thing needed to limit the number of embryos is a patient request. But they're told, and she has a beautiful perspective on this. I say beautiful, I mean insightful.
Yeah, yeah.
About how women are in a very desperate position, and how people, not everyone, but I think a lot of people in the IVF industry prey on them when they're in this really difficult emotional place. And if they request less, then she said she's seen them be told, well, you're compromising your success, so you really shouldn't have that low number. And you're like, okay, that's manipulative, right? So
that's why really a large part of this is taking advantage, whether they realize it or not, taking advantage the very sensitive place that women struggling with infertility are in. Okay.
Exactly.
Talk about trying not to make an emotional decision.
Which commodifies the woman.
Yeah, yes.
You know?
Yes. And these are all the little pieces that people don't realize are being really pushed, like, or really taken advantage of by the IVF industry. So we don't realize what, like, okay, say in this, we have all these rationalizations and these justifications, right? If we're going to do IVF, but like, we don't realize.
Understandably, like we all
understandably,
like, this is a space where
the messages that are being communicated and what we're willing to say about ourselves too.
Yeah.
And that's why this is so hard.
Exactly. And I want people to have this perspective of, it doesn't have to be this way. In my dream world, we would stop making embryos completely. But you know what would also be better? At least establish laws that have limits. Yeah. So what happened is, in Italy, they used to have a law that you could only create 3 embryos, and all 3 had to be implanted at the same time. That was it. They were not going to be frozen. Germany, believe it or not, so Italy, that's no longer the case. From what I understand, if I'm not mistaken, Germany, and perhaps because Germany has seen so much, right, in the medical use and abuse of the system, right, because Nazi Germany and everything that happened, experiments there. But they are the ones, I mean, they're the ones that I'm like, man, we should learn from you right now, because they're standing up for the fact that, no, we're not going to create over, I believe it's 2 or 3. And you create 2 or 3, and then you have to implant 2 or 3, but we're not storing them. And I would say manipulating a woman in that process. So my heartbeating call is, tell people we need to stop making these embryos. And at least in a practical way, we need to establish some kind of legal standards to minimize the number. And so then to minimize the number of frozen embryos that we create, which is our responsibility, and we still play a part in it. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that, but we have a lot of people who are all pro-life advocates. I'm like, yeah, this is part of that discussion, and this needs to come up. This is extremely important. This is extremely important. I could go on a whole other talk. I won't, but it's extremely important. So to end it, I want to say my suggestions for parents who are in this discernment. Number 1, personalize your children, name your children, pray for your children. And if you are someone listening to this and you are not a parent of frozen embryos, still pray for them. Look, I do not understand. I do not have the mind of God to know, but I do believe that God the Father always has a plan, and he works everything together for our good. So though I do not see a way through this philosophically that would make this the answer, or theologically that would make this the answer for an embryo adoption, I don't think it's the answer. I do believe that God does have a plan, and we need to ask him to bring that to light, right? And we need to ask him to bless these children. At the end of every one of our consults, we share a line from the catechism. And so I kind of want to close with that. And then I'll give you 3 quick resources if people want to go, just kind of look for more. In the end, we quote from the catechism, paragraph 1785, where it says, and this is us in asking everyone, right, to go to those deeper places with the Lord, to take these questions to prayer and to the sacraments. And we encourage them to, in the formation of conscience, the word of God is always the light for our path. We must assimilate it in faith and prayer. We must also examine our conscience before the Lord's cross. We are assisted by the gifts of the Holy Spirit, aided by the witness or advice of others, and guided by the authoritative teaching of the church. You are not alone in this discernment. I want you to know that. And so my top resource to recommend for you is to reach out to the National Catholic Bioethics Center, to their personal consultations line. If you or anyone you know wants to discuss this further, very much an option, especially walking through what else is there then going on in sort of this in between. How do we best love our children, right? The other thing I want people to know about, and this also applies for miscarriage, but also if you find out that, for example, your frozen embryos, for some reason, the lab, something went wrong and they thawed, and so they died. There is an organization called Sacred Heart Guardians, and they will work with you to find a way to bury your children. And so I highly recommend them as a resource. And then the last resource I want to mention that from what I understand is actually recently established is called Shiloh IVF. I think they do a really beautiful job. I've kind of looked through their website. My boss was in contact with the woman, I believe, as she founded it, but it's a post IVF ministry. And they have a page, I believe it's called, the honoring page. And you can go, I mean, it's beautiful. I was brought to tears. You can go and write a letter or write a poem to your children. Like, this is a way for you to tangibly, if that's what you need, right? To go and to say and to express something, right? That might be part of your own healing process. But similar, if you're familiar with Rachel's Vineyard and the abortion healing retreat, right? This would be for post IVF. And I also want to say to anyone who's been in this situation with IVF in any facet of what we've talked about, the Lord sees you in your cry. He sees you in your desire. You are good. Your desire is good. And those gut-wrenching cries to him, I beg of you, do not let those become the seeds of bitterness that block you from his embrace, right? Go to him, run to him, yell at him. I mean, be honest with him, right? I mean, I'm super sassy, especially with the Lord, but that's how we can have intimacy, is I'm honest. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for letting me have this time with you and for letting me express all these things with you that I've learned. I hope it can be fruitful. Please share it with whomever if you think it would benefit them. And Mary, just thank you for the opportunity to come talk about this.
Thank you, Sarah, surely from the bottom of my heart, and I know I speak for everyone on here, some people are making comments. Thank you so much for delivering this information just the way that you did, which is so charitable and also really helps us to go and take it to the Lord and discern and to continue to research and do our own investigating. Like, I just think you did a beautiful job. And some of the thoughts I was having as you were closing out there is like, I just feel this big call to back up again, and let's put the emphasis where it's necessary. Is the starting point is humanizing embryos. That's where we need to start. And understanding this IVF culture that we have created, the more we can talk about and have conversations like this, because I think these are just kind of like, these are just thoughts that are there and people don't talk about it. So I think talking about it, humanizing the embryos, that's a really good starting place. And you said God brings good things out of these bad situations. And I'm just like wondering is it the end of the IVF industry? Because I feel like this is a really good introduction to that conversation. Be like, okay, we have created this problem that doesn't have a solution. All right, well, let's talk about IVF. And I would just say that to wrap this up, and unless you have anything you want to add.
Well, no, I was just going to add to that is that even with the election conversations that we're having, where people there was a lot of confusion what people meant by terms, of course, but then the case in Alabama earlier this year, I will say that I did see that as a win in the sense that, so they, you know, I'm not going to spin all the particulars, but it was basically claiming legally in Alabama that these frozen embryos that had accidentally been destroyed were children. And everybody was up in arms because they're like, this is going to destroy the IVF industry. We're not going to be able to do our jobs. But I was like, this is so important.
Yes.
Because it's lifting the veil. We need to say that these are children. And that's what John Paul II was saying, was legally recognize them as children. Interestingly enough, Mary, I just found this out last night. I'm not confident because I was trying to go through the law and figure out if it's still there. You know, the law's changed. I think it's still there. But in 1986, Louisiana was the one state that gave like legal recognition to a frozen embryo.
Oh, come on.
Which is probably why after Katrina, it could be such a big lawsuit. And I was like,
what a difference naming things as they are makes.
So that, I just want to confirm what you said, Mary. If we can leave all together on the same page, it would be an invitation to prayer.
Yes.
But also, let's help humanize these children, because they stand as a testament and a witness to the failure of the IVF industry.
Yes.
And when we can when we bring that to the light, just remember what John Paul II always taught us is like, evil will always devour itself. The truth will always win. So let's bring the light.
Yes. I love that. And as a church, let's do a better job of addressing the issue of IVF, which I know, you know, we're working hard to do that. So Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank
Thank you,
you. Mhm.
Sarah, Dr. Sarah,
Of
Denny,
course.
Lorio. Where can people find you? Tell us real quick about your website
Yes,
and your
please.
podcast.
Okay. If you would like to follow anything that I'm doing, I am starting a podcast. My website is whatwomenare.com. I'm so excited about this podcast. I'm launching it on the Feast of Our Lady Guadalupe on December 12th. You can follow me on Instagram at this handle at dr.sarahdennylorio. Also, I have a specific Instagram page for the podcast, and it is about to start ramping up because I just posted my trailer and I'm so excited. That is at What Women Are Official. And for those who are wondering, you might be familiar with the quote, but the inspiration is Edith Stein, who's one of my heroes. And she said, the world does not need what women have. It needs what women are. So whatwomenare.com, at What Women Are Official. Please follow me at this handle, dr.sarahdennylorio. And I would love to have you follow along. I'm hoping to put out resources for parents about how to talk to their daughters about their changing bodies, about courses on love and responsibility. The podcast is going to highlight the power of a woman's story, but I'm also going to hopefully get my dissertation published for public consumption, where I put John Paul II and Margaret Sanger into a dialogue. And if you go on my personal Instagram, there's a link tree and you can see an interview I did with a friend, Dr. Mario Sacasa. And there you can hear, it's a long, shocking, I talk a lot, but it's a long, like 2-hour
It's so
podcast
good.
where you really see
You need to go listen
the
to it
dialogue. I
now.
love the dialogue. So please, that's my heart. Please go listen to it and
Yes.
just be open to what the spirit can teach you in
Yes.
that space.
I have heard this episode. It's one of the best podcast episodes that I've listened to, and I mean it. Like, for all the people who follow me here on women's health, fertility awareness, and all the things, and infertility, all the things that I talk about, you're gonna get a new perspective you haven't heard from Sarah in this podcast episode. So
Thank you.
Definitely worth a listen. Thank you all again for being here, Sarah. I love you. I'll talk to you soon. Y'all have a wonderful day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.